I never expected anyone to break into my study, not because the house was impenetrable. Moonhaven Quarter had its share of skilled thieves who could slip past guards and locked doors like smoke through a cracked window, but because there was nothing in that room worth the risk on a night like this. The silver was locked downstairs in the main safe. The important contracts were sealed inside the iron chest behind the false panel, and the most valuable thing in the entire room was the silence I had spent years learning to protect. Yet there she was. I had returned late from another endless dinner with the Merchant Council. The scent of spiced wine and expensive perfume still clung to the collar of my coat as I climbed the stairs. The hallway lamps were turned low, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors. My footsteps were the only sound in the house. I was already thinking about pouring myself a final glass of brandy and forgetting the evening when I noticed it. The study door was ajar, and the window inside was open just enough for the cool night air to slip through like an uninvited guest. I stopped at the top of the stairs. My hand moved instinctively toward the small blade hidden in my sleeve, but I didn't draw it. Instead, I stood still and listened. The house was quiet except for the soft hiss of rain against the glass and the distant murmur of the city below the hill. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, lit only by the thin blade of moonlight cutting across the floor. In the middle of that silver light stood a figure I had never seen before. She was tall, taller than most human women I had ever met. Her shoulders were broad but not bulky, her waist tapered sharply before flaring into strong, powerful hips. Her skin was a deep, muted green-gray that caught the moonlight like wet river stone. Long black hair was tied back in a messy braid that had come partially undone strands sticking to the damp skin of her neck and collarbone. She wore tight black clothing that left almost nothing to the imagination. The fabric clung to every curve, every line of muscle, every place where her body promised both danger and something far more tempting. She was reaching into the third drawer on the left, the one with the double lock that only I knew how to open. I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms. I usually charge admission for that view. Her entire body tensed. In one fluid motion, she spun around, a short blade appearing in her hand as if it had always been there. Her eyes, sharp amber gold, locked onto mine. There was no panic in them, only calculation. She didn't run, not immediately. "You're not screaming for the guards," she said. Her voice was low, slightly rough, like smoke over gravel. "I'm considering it." I tilted my head, but then I'd missed the rest of the show. She glanced once at the open window behind her, then back at me. Rain dripped from her braid onto the floorboards. "You're Cassian Vale, and you're in my study at 2 in the morning. I let my gaze travel over her deliberately. Not that I'm complaining about the company. Her jaw tightened. The blade stayed steady. "I'm not here for conversation. Clearly, you're here for whatever is in that drawer." I took one slow step forward. "Tell me, what exactly were you hoping to find, Gold Jewels, or something more interesting?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached back, snatched a small folded paper from the drawer, and tucked it inside her collar. The movement caused the already strained fabric across her chest to pull tighter for a brief second. I felt something stir in my chest, not fear, not anger. Something sharper, curiosity, excitement, the kind I hadn't felt in years. She moved toward the window. I stepped sideways, blocking her path. "Not yet." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't want to do this." "Actually, I think I do." In the next breath, she was moving fast, silent, lethal. She feinted left, then dropped low and tried to slip past me. I caught her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to stop her. For one heartbeat, we were inches apart. Her scent hit me rain leather and something green and sharp like crushed mint. Her breath was warm against my jaw. The blade in her other hand hovered near my ribs, not pressing but ready. "Release me," she said quietly. "Give me your name first." She smiled, then a small, dangerous curve of her lips. "You don't get to demand anything from me, rich boy." She twisted. I let her go at the exact moment she expected me to hold tighter. The surprise worked. She stumbled half a step. I used that half step to pluck the small silver hairpin shaped like a raven from where it had been tucked in her belt. She noticed immediately. "Give that back. Come and take it." For a second I thought she would. Her eyes burned with something wild and bright. Then she laughed, once short, sharp, almost impressed, and leaped backward onto the windowsill in one smooth motion. "Keep it," she said. "Consider it payment for the entertainment." She dropped into the night. I walked to the window and looked down. The garden below was empty. Only the rain and the dark. On the floor where she had stood lay a single scrap of paper that had slipped from her clothing during the struggle. I picked it up. 3 lines written in a neat, precise hand. "Ledger of St. Arlen School Fund. Hales and Bryn shipping contracts. West Vault Key." I stared at the paper for a long time. Then I smiled genuinely for the first time in months. The next morning, I went to St. Arlen Academy under the pretense of checking the latest donation. I had no real interest in the new bookshelves. I only wanted to see her in daylight, and when I finally did, standing on the stone veranda in a simple gray teaching gown, hair neatly braided, surrounded by laughing children who clearly adored her, I understood exactly how dangerous this woman was. Because the same person who had broken into my house with a blade and stolen my sleep was now gently correcting a little girl's handwriting while the morning sun touched her green-gray skin like it had been waiting for her all along. I stood under the colonnade and watched her. She felt my gaze. When her golden eyes met mine across the courtyard, there was no fear, only recognition, and the smallest, sharpest hint of a challenge. I smiled back. Game on. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. A curious incident. A fleeting distraction in an otherwise monotonous life. I had seen many unusual things in Moonhaven, and a lone orc woman slipping through my window in the dead of night was simply one more. By the time I finished my coffee and stepped into the carriage for the day's meetings, I had almost convinced myself I would forget her by evening. I lasted until noon. St. Arlen Academy sat on a quiet hill at the edge of the quarter, its white stone walls glowing under the pale spring sun. I had no real reason to be there. The library restoration fund was already approved, and the bookshelves were being installed next month. Yet I found myself walking through the main gate with the excuse that I wanted to inspect the progress in person. The headmistress greeted me warmly, as she always did when money was involved, and offered to show me around. I declined the tour. Instead, I asked if I could observe one of the classes. Any class. It didn't matter. She gave me a long, knowing look but said nothing. She simply led me to the eastern veranda and left me there with a quiet smile that suggested she understood more than I wanted her to. I stood under the shade of a stone arch and waited. Children spilled out of the classrooms in waves of laughter and chatter. And then I saw her. Sarah Vark. She was not dressed in black tonight. She wore a simple gray teaching gown that fell to her ankles, modest and unadorned. Her long black hair was braided neatly down her back, secured with a thin blue ribbon. In the daylight, the green-gray tone of her skin looked softer, almost warm, like river stone touched by sunlight. She carried a stack of slates in her arms and walked among the children with an ease that made it seem as though she had always belonged here. A small group gathered around her. A little human girl tugged at her sleeve, asking something about a story from yesterday. Sarah knelt down to the child's level, her voice low and patient as she answered. The girl's face lit up. Another child, a boy with messy hair, showed her a drawing he had made. Sarah took the paper with both hands and studied it seriously as if it were the most important thing in the world. I couldn't look away. This was the same woman who had pressed a blade to my ribs only nights ago. The same woman who had moved through my study like a shadow and stolen something from my locked drawer without hesitation. Now she was smiling gently at a child's clumsy drawing, her golden eyes soft with genuine interest. The contrast was so complete it felt almost cruel. I stayed longer than I should have. Long enough to see her dismiss the class with a quiet word and a warm smile. Long enough to watch her walk across the courtyard, the hem of her gown brushing the stone path. Long enough to notice how the other teachers greeted her with real affection and how the children turned their heads to follow her even after she had passed. She felt my gaze. When her eyes found mine across the open space, she didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She simply held my stare for one long, steady moment, as if she had been expecting me. Then she gave the smallest nod, polite, professional, the kind any teacher might give to a wealthy patron visiting the academy, as if we had never met before, as if she had never climbed through my window in the dark. I smiled back, slow and deliberate. She turned and continued walking, but I saw the way her shoulders tensed just slightly. She knew I was watching, and she knew I wasn't going to stop. That night, I left the study window open again. I sat in the dark with only one candle burning low on the desk. The rain from earlier had eased into a soft drizzle that tapped gently against the glass. I didn't pretend to read. I simply waited, listening to the quiet creak of the old house settling around me. She came just after midnight. The sound was so faint I almost missed it, the soft scrape of boots on the windowsill. She dropped inside without a sound, rainwater sliding from her cloak onto the floor. The moment her feet touched the rug, she knew I was there. She turned slowly, her golden eyes catching the candlelight. "You're waiting for me," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am." She pushed the hood back. Wet strands of black hair clung to her cheeks. The black clothing she wore tonight was different, tighter, more worn at the edges, as if she had been moving through places where fine fabric would only get her noticed for the wrong reasons. "Why?" she asked. "Because I want to know who you really are." She stepped closer to the desk, her gaze flicking to the drawer she had opened before. "You left it unlocked again." "I did." She looked at me for a long moment as if trying to decide whether I was a trap or simply a fool. "You're either very brave or very stupid, Cassian Vale. Perhaps both." She reached for the drawer anyway, but this time she didn't open it immediately. Her fingers rested on the handle as she studied me. "You could have called the guards the first night," she said quietly. You could have had me arrested. Why didn't you? I leaned back in the chair, watching the way the candlelight moved across her face. Because the moment I saw you, I knew you weren't here for money or jewels. You were looking for something specific. Something hidden. And I wanted to know why. She was silent. I continued, my voice low. I also wanted to see if you would come back. She smiled, then small, sharp, and dangerous. And here I am. She opened the drawer and took out the same folded paper she had dropped the first night. This time she didn't hide it. She placed it on the desk between us. You know what this is, she said. I do. Then you know why I need it. I looked at the paper, then back at her. Tell me anyway. She hesitated. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her golden eyes. St. Arlen is more than a school, she said finally. It's the only place some of those children have. If the wrong people get their hands on certain records, those children will disappear. Not metaphorically, literally. Her voice didn't shake, but I heard the steel beneath it. I'm not stealing for myself, she continued. I'm stealing to keep them safe. I didn't speak for a long time. The rain tapped softly against the window. Finally, I asked, and what happens if you get caught? She met my eyes without flinching. Then I disappear too. I stood up slowly and walked around the desk until I was standing in front of her, close enough to see the faint scar along her collarbone that her high collar couldn't quite hide, close enough to smell the rain on her skin. I'm not going to stop you, I said. She looked up at me surprised. But I'm also not going to let you do this alone anymore. Her expression changed, not fear, not anger, but something quieter. Something that looked almost like recognition. You don't know what you're offering, she whispered. I think I do. She reached out and touched the edge of the paper on the desk with one finger. Then you're either the most foolish man in Moonhaven, she said softly, or the most dangerous. I smiled. Perhaps both. She didn't smile back, but the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. She took the paper and tucked it inside her coat. Before she turned toward the window, she paused. Cassian. Yes, don't make me regret this. She disappeared into the rain without another word. I stood alone in the study, listening to the sound of the drizzle against the glass, and realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit until that moment. I was no longer merely curious. I was already in too deep, and I had no intention of climbing out. 3 nights passed after she left my study, and the house felt heavier than it had any right to. I tried to return to my usual rhythm. Meetings with investors, reviews of shipping contracts, dinners where people smiled too wide and spoke too carefully. But every time the clock struck midnight, my eyes drifted toward the study door. Every time rain tapped against the windows, I caught myself listening for the faint scrape of boots on the sill. She didn't come. On the 4th night, I left the window unlatched again. I sat in the dark with only one candle burning low, pretending to read the same ledger I had already memorized 3 times. The rain outside had turned soft and steady, the kind that blurred the edges of the city lights below the hill. I waited. At some point after midnight, the sound came quiet, deliberate, unmistakable. A single boot touched the windowsill. She slipped inside rainwater, sliding from her cloak onto the floorboards. The moment her feet touched the rug, she knew I was there. She turned slowly, her golden eyes catching the candlelight. You're still waiting, she said. It wasn't a question. I am. She pushed the hood back. Wet strands of black hair clung to her cheeks and neck. The black clothing she wore tonight was different, tighter, more worn at the edges, as if she had been moving through places where fine fabric would only get her noticed for the wrong reasons. I came for the Hales and Bryn contracts, she said, straight to the point. They're in the 2nd drawer, same place as last time. She narrowed her eyes. You're making this too easy. Maybe I want you to stay longer. A beat of silence stretched between us. Rain drummed softly against the glass. She moved to the desk anyway, opened the drawer, and pulled out the thick folder. She flipped through the pages quickly, her long fingers steady, despite the water still dripping from her sleeves. I watched her read. Not the documents, the way her brow creased when she found what she was looking for. The way her shoulders relaxed just slightly when she realized the papers were real. You're not going to stop me, she asked without looking up. No. Why? Because whatever you're doing, it's bigger than stealing, and I'm tired of pretending I don't care. She closed the folder slowly and tucked it inside her coat. When she finally met my eyes again, something had shifted in her gaze, less guarded, more dangerous. You don't know what you're stepping into, Cassian. Then tell me. She hesitated. For the first time, she looked like she was actually considering it. Not here, she said. Not tonight. If you really want to know, meet me at the old bell tower by the east docks tomorrow at the 3rd bell after midnight. I nodded once. She turned toward the window, then paused. And Cassian, yes. Bring a blade. You might need it. She disappeared into the rain without another word. I didn't sleep that night. The next evening, I left the house alone, dressed in dark clothes that wouldn't draw attention. The East Docks were a different world from Moonhaven narrow alleys, salt-stained walls, and the constant smell of fish and rot. The old bell tower stood half-ruined at the end of a broken pier, its bronze bell long since stolen. I arrived early and waited in the shadows. She came at the exact moment the distant city bells rang the third hour. Silent, controlled, dressed in the same black she always wore when she worked. This time she carried a small oil lantern that cast almost no light. "You actually came," she said. "You sound disappointed. I'm not used to people keeping their word when it costs them something." We moved together without needing to speak. She led the way through a maze of abandoned warehouses until we reached a low iron door half hidden behind crates. She picked the lock in seconds. Inside was a storage room filled with shelves of ledgers and sealed wooden boxes. The air smelled of dust and old paper. Sarah moved with purpose, leading us deeper until we reached a reinforced iron door at the back. She worked the lock with a set of slender tools, her fingers quick and sure. The door clicked open. Inside the vault, rows of metal cabinets lined the walls. Sarah went straight to the third cabinet on the left. I kept watch at the doorway, listening for any sound outside. She pulled out a thick ledger and began flipping pages. Her breath caught. Here she whispered. "The original manifests. Names, ships, payments, everything." I moved beside her and looked over her shoulder. The lists were worse than I had imagined. Hundreds of names. Children. Young women. Men sold under false contracts. And at the bottom of each page, the same signature. Dorian Vale. My own blood. Rage rose in my chest, slow and burning. I had always known Dorian was ruthless, but this was something else. This was systematic. This was profitable evil wearing the face of family. Sarah closed the ledger and tucked it inside her coat. "We have what we need." We turned to leave. That was when the door at the far end of the warehouse slammed open. 3 guards burst in, lanterns swinging. One of them spotted us immediately. Intruders. The first shot rang out before I could react. It tore through the air inches from Sarah's head and buried itself in the brick wall behind us. I shoved her behind a stack of crates and drew the blade at my side. "Run!" I shouted. She didn't run. She stayed right beside me. We fought our way back through the warehouse. I took down the first guard with a hard strike to the jaw. Sarah moved like liquid shadow, disarming the second with a precise kick to his wrist. The third guard fired again. This time the bullet found me. Pain exploded in my left arm. Hot, sharp. I staggered but kept moving. Sarah's eyes widened when she saw the blood soaking my sleeve. "Cassian, I'm fine," I growled. "Keep going." We burst out the side door and into the rain. The city night swallowed us as we ran through the narrow alleys, boots splashing in puddles, breath coming hard. Sarah kept glancing at my arm, her face tight with something I had never seen on her before. Worry. We finally stopped in the shelter of an abandoned boathouse near the river. I leaned against the wooden wall, pressing my hand to the wound. It was bleeding freely, but not dangerously deep. Sarah tore a strip from the bottom of her shirt without hesitation and wrapped it tightly around my arm. Her hands were steady, but her voice wasn't. "You were shot because of me. I was shot because I chose to be here." She finished tying the bandage and looked up at me. Rainwater ran down her face. Her golden eyes were bright with something raw and unguarded. "I told you not to follow me," she whispered. "And I told you I don't take orders well." She exhaled a shaky laugh and pressed her forehead against my chest for a moment. Just a moment. Then she pulled back the mask of control, slipping back into place. "We need to get you home." We made our way back through the city in silence. When we finally reached my house, the servants had long gone to bed. I locked the study door behind us and lit a single lamp. Sarah helped me out of my wet coat and cleaned the wound properly with hot water and clean cloth. Her touch was careful, almost tender. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at me. "You could have died tonight. So could you." She was quiet for a long time. "I don't want you in this anymore," she said finally. "It's too dangerous. Dorian is your family. If he finds out you helped me, he already knows I cut in, and I don't care." Sarah stared at me. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your blood," she said softly, "but I'm telling you what this path costs." I reached out and brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. "I already chose." The words hung between us. Then she leaned in and kissed me slow, deep, and full of everything we had been holding back for weeks. Her hand slid into my hair. Mine found her waist and pulled her closer. The kiss tasted of rain and adrenaline and the quiet realization that we were no longer pretending. When we broke apart, her forehead rested against mine. Her breath was warm against my lips. "I'm not asking you to be safe," she whispered. "I'm asking you to be sure." "I'm sure." She closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded once. "Then we do this together." We climbed out of the canal further downstream, soaked and freezing, but no longer pretending we stood on opposite sides. For the first time, we were walking the same path, and I had never been more certain that I would follow her wherever it led. The days after our escape from the canal blurred into something I no longer recognized as my old life. Sarah no longer came to me only through the window. She came through the front door when the household had gone to bed, slipping past the guards with the same quiet precision she once used to break into my study. We no longer pretended our meetings were accidental. We planned them. We prepared. Every night we met in the study, the door locked, the lamps turned low. She spread stolen papers across my desk while I poured 2 glasses of wine. We spoke in low voices about routes, guards, timing. She taught me how to move without sound. I taught her how to read the hidden patterns in the contracts of the wealthy. We were no longer hunter and hunted. We had become something far more dangerous, partners. On the 5th night, she placed a single map on the table between us. Her finger tapped a spot near the river's edge. Warehouse 7, she said, the real heart of it. I studied the drawing. The warehouse sat in the heart of Dock 9, surrounded by chained gates, patrolled dogs and men who answered only to Dorian and the Hales and Bryn consortium. It was not a place for mistakes. You're sure the original manifests are there? I asked. Positive. They keep everything in the inner vault. Names, destinations, payments. If we burn those, the entire chain collapses. I looked at her across the candlelight. Her braid had loosened from the day's teaching, strands of black hair framing the sharp line of her cheekbones. The green-gray of her skin seemed softer in the warm glow, but her eyes were still the same sharp, unyielding, beautiful in a way that made breathing feel secondary. We go together, I said. She didn't argue this time. She only nodded. Tomorrow night. 3rd bell after midnight. The following evening, the city felt heavier than usual. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the streets slick and the air thick with the smell of wet stone and river mud. I dressed in dark, unremarkable clothes, the kind a rich man would never wear unless he had something to hide. Sarah met me at the edge of the docks, already in her night gear. No words were needed. We moved like shadows between the warehouses, avoiding the circles of lantern light cast by the patrols. Warehouse 7 loomed ahead, a hulking brick building with iron-barred windows and a heavy iron door. 2 guards stood at the front, talking in low voices. Sarah signaled me to wait. She disappeared into the darkness along the side wall. Minutes later, I heard a soft thud, then nothing. 1 guard slumped to the ground. The other followed seconds later. She reappeared at my side, breathing steady, clear. We slipped inside. The interior was a maze of tall shelves stacked with crates and wooden boxes. The air smelled of oil dust and old paper. Sarah moved with purpose, leading us deeper until we reached a reinforced iron door at the back. She worked the lock with a set of slender tools, her fingers quick and sure. The door clicked open. Inside the vault, rows of metal cabinets lined the walls. Sarah went straight to the 3rd cabinet on the left. I kept watch at the doorway, listening for any sound outside. She pulled out a thick ledger and began flipping pages. Her breath caught. Here, she whispered, the original manifests. Names, ships, payments, everything. I moved beside her and looked over her shoulder. The lists were worse than I had imagined. Hundreds of names. Children, young women, men sold under false contracts. And at the bottom of each page, the same signature. Dorian Vale. My own blood. Rage rose in my chest, slow and burning. I'd always known Dorian was ruthless, but this was something else. This was systematic. This was profitable evil wearing the face of family. Sarah closed the ledger and tucked it inside her coat. We have what we need. We turned to leave. That was when the door at the far end of the warehouse slammed open. 3 guards burst in, lanterns swinging. One of them spotted us immediately. Intruders. The first shot rang out before I could react. It tore through the air inches from Sarah's head and buried itself in the brick wall behind us. I shoved her behind a stack of crates and drew the blade at my side. Run, I shouted. She didn't run. She stayed right beside me. We fought our way back through the warehouse. I took down the first guard with a hard strike to the jaw. Sarah moved like liquid shadow, disarming the second with a precise kick to his wrist. The 3rd guard fired again. This time the bullet found me. Pain exploded in my left arm. Hot, sharp. I staggered but kept moving. Sarah's eyes widened when she saw the blood soaking my sleeve. Cassian. I'm fine, I growled. Keep going. We burst out the side door and into the rain. The city night swallowed us as we ran through the narrow alleys, boots splashing in puddles, breath coming hard. Sarah kept glancing at my arm, her face tight with something I had never seen on her before. Worry. We finally stopped in the shelter of an abandoned boathouse near the river. I leaned against the wooden wall, pressing my hand to the wound. It was bleeding freely, but not dangerously deep. Sarah tore a strip from the bottom of her shirt without hesitation and wrapped it tightly around my arm. Her hands were steady, but her voice wasn't. You were shot because of me. I was shot because I chose to be here. She finished tying the bandage and looked up at me. Rainwater ran down her face. Her golden eyes were bright with something raw and unguarded. "I told you not to follow me," she whispered. "And I told you I don't take orders well." She exhaled a shaky laugh and pressed her forehead against my chest for a moment. Just a moment. Then she pulled back the mask of control, slipping back into place. "We need to get you home." We made our way back through the city in silence. When we finally reached my house, the servants had long gone to bed. I locked the study door behind us and lit a single lamp. Sarah helped me out of my wet coat and cleaned the wound properly with hot water and clean cloth. Her touch was careful, almost tender. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at me. "You could have died tonight. So could you." She was quiet for a long time. "I don't want you in this anymore," she said finally. "It's too dangerous. Dorian is your family. If he finds out you helped me, he already knows I cut in, and I don't care." Sarah stared at me. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your blood," she said softly, "but I'm telling you what this path costs." I reached out and brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. "I already chose." The words hung between us. Then she leaned in and kissed me slow, deep, and full of everything we had been holding back for weeks. Her hands slid into my hair. Mine found her waist and pulled her closer. The kiss tasted of rain and adrenaline and the quiet realization that we were no longer pretending. When we broke apart, her forehead rested against mine. Her breath was warm against my lips. "I'm not asking you to be safe," she whispered. "I'm asking you to be sure." "I'm sure." She closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded once. "Then we do this together." We climbed out of the canal further downstream, soaked and freezing, but no longer pretending we stood on opposite sides. For the first time, we were walking the same path, and I had never been more certain that I would follow her wherever it led. The final confrontation didn't happen in the shadows. It happened under the bright chandeliers of the Merchants' Hall during the annual gala where every powerful family in Moonhaven gathered to pretend they were untouchable. The hall was filled with the sound of string music, clinking crystal, and polite laughter that masked the sharp edges of deals being made in corners. I arrived early, dressed in formal black, the kind of suit that announced wealth without needing to shout. My name alone was enough to make people step aside as I moved through the crowd. Dorian was already there. He stood near the center of the room, surrounded by investors and minor nobles, his hand resting too possessively on the shoulder of a young woman who looked barely old enough to be smiling back at him. When our eyes met across the sea of silk and jewels, his smile sharpened into something cold and knowing. "Cassian," he called, clapping me on the back as if we were old friends. "You've been avoiding these events lately. Busy with other matters." I met his gaze, without flinching. "You could say that." He laughed, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. Still playing the mysterious recluse? Or is it something more interesting these days? Before I could answer, the room's attention shifted. Sarah had entered. She was not the Velvet Crow tonight. She wore a deep emerald gown that clung to her strong frame with quiet elegance. Her long black hair was swept up, revealing the clean line of her neck and the subtle green-gray tone of her skin that caught the light like polished river stone. She looked every inch the respected lecturer from St. Arlen composed graceful and completely out of place among the human elite who stared at her with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. She walked straight toward us. Dorian's smile froze the moment he saw her. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath as she stopped beside me close enough that our arms brushed. "Good evening, Dorian," she said calmly, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. His face went pale, then flushed with barely contained rage. "You." "Yes," she said simply. "Me." Before he could respond, I raised my voice so the entire room could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I said I have something you all need to see." I nodded to the musicians. The music stopped. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Sarah stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the central table. She opened it slowly, revealing the manifests, the ledgers, the signed orders, all bearing Dorian's name in clear, unmistakable ink. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Dorian lunged for the papers. I caught his wrist before he could reach them, my grip firm and unyielding. "Touch them," I said, quietly loud enough for those closest to hear, "and I will break your arm in front of everyone here." The room erupted. Shouts of disbelief. Accusations flying in every direction. People demanding answers. The powerful families who had quietly profited from Dorian's network suddenly found themselves under the same harsh light they had once used to hide their own sins. In the chaos, Sarah slipped away from the table. I followed her. She was already moving toward the side exit when two of Dorian's men appeared blocking her path. One of them grabbed her arm roughly. She twisted free and drove her elbow into his throat with brutal efficiency. The second man drew a knife. I was there in time. The fight was short, ugly, and real. I took a cut to my side from the blade, but I disarmed him and sent him crashing into a nearby table. Sarah and I ran together through the back corridors of the hall, the sound of pursuit echoing behind us. We burst out into the rain-soaked alley behind the building. Sarah was breathing hard. Her emerald gown was torn at the shoulder, and blood was seeping from a shallow wound on her arm where one of the men had cut her. "You're hurt," I said, pulling her into the shadows of the alley. "It's nothing. It's not nothing." I pressed my hand to the wound to stem the bleeding. She winced but didn't pull away. Her golden eyes met mine fierce, even in pain. "They'll come for us now," she whispered. "Let them." I kissed her, then hard and desperate, tasting rain and blood and the certainty that I would burn the entire city down if it meant keeping her safe. We made it back to my house just before dawn. I carried her upstairs to the bedroom, ignoring the pain in my own side. Oren had already prepared hot water and clean bandages. He didn't ask questions. He simply helped me tend to her wounds and then left us alone. Sarah lay on the bed, her arm bandaged, her torn gown discarded. She looked exhausted but alive. I sat beside her, my hand resting on hers. "I'm not letting you go," I said quietly. "Not tonight. Not ever." She looked up at me, her expression soft in a way I had never seen before. "I'm not running anymore," she whispered. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, then her lips, slow and gentle this time. The kind of kiss that promised forever instead of just one night. In the weeks that followed, the city changed. Dorian was arrested. The network he had built crumbled under the weight of the evidence we had provided. Many of the powerful families who had quietly profited from it suddenly found themselves under investigation. St. Arlen was safe. The children who had been sold were found and returned. Sarah continued teaching by day. At night, when the city needed her, she was still Velvet Crow, but now she had me behind her, guarding her back, standing beside her in the dark. And I was no longer the distant third richest man in Moonhaven. I was the man who had chosen love over power, truth over comfort, and a woman who had once broken into my house over a life of perfect, empty silence. She had stolen more than my sleep that first night. She had stolen my heart, and I had never been happier to let it go. The end.